Thanks a lot, Sophia. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, glad to be with everyone. I'll go ahead and share my screen, and yeah, I'll basically be talking about the work we do on the MathGen team in OpenAI. That's the team I've been a part of for the last couple of years. And let's see, let me get this shared. Yeah, so we put out this paper a few months ago. So it's kind of represents some of our latest work. And the idea really is just that, yeah, as you said, math and reasoning really highlights one of our model's biggest weaknesses, and so that's why I'm really excited to work on this problem. And for the audience, feel free to jump in really at any point with questions. I'd love to have this be as much of a discussion as possible, but even if not, we'll certainly have some dedicated time at the end for questions. So this is joint work with my wonderful team at OpenAI. All the names here on the slide. Yeah, it's been really exciting to work on this project with them. So brief overview of my talk. I'll start with some kind of high-level motivation, why we are excited to work on math and reasoning in general, and also what sort of led us specifically to the method that I'll be talking about today called process supervision. Then I'll dive into the method itself and talk about what it is, why it works, or at least why we think it works well. Then I'll have some time to go through some examples, basically highlighting some of both the most impressive problems that we can get the model to solve in the math domain, and then also really convey some of the weaknesses that still elude us even after all this work. Then I'll talk about some ablations, really just diving into more more detailed explanation of which parts of this whole project really mattered the most, we think. And I'll close out with some future work that we'll plan to do. So first, a bit about our high-level motivation. Why do we even want to work on reasoning and LLMs? I mean, obviously, LLMs have really, well, they've been taking off for a while, but particularly in the last year, have really gone mainstream. And I've been working on LLMs for probably about the last 3 years, and really from day one, what I wanted to get involved with was reasoning because, as I said, I think this just highlights one of the main failure modes in the models. In general, obviously these models demonstrate kind of a superhuman breadth of knowledge, but overall, I would say the depth is pretty shallow of the understanding of any one thing. They can obviously regurgitate a lot of information, and that information can have the appearance of depth sometimes. But if you really, probe them deeply on any one topic, it's not too hard to get them to either contradict themselves or to straight up, hallucinate some sort of fact because it's convenient for the conversation. And this is really what we want to get better and better at. And this is true, of course, for OpenAI as a whole, as well as my team. My team specifically approaches this problem through the lens of math and reasoning. But these are also, of course, very general problems, as I'm sure you all are familiar with. And of course, our goal really is to build safe and aligned AGI. And in order to get to AGI, one way or another, we have to be able to solve these kind of hard problems. We have to be able to, sample from the model and have them have long, coherent trajectories where they're doing many, many steps of reasoning. And we've seen over the last couple of years that the sort of coherence has very much increased. Back in kind of GP3 days, even a couple steps into a problem, the model is likely to fall off course. And now, it's we can do 20, 30 steps, and it's very, very decent chance that they're correct. But sooner or later, we're sort of moved from the single digit steps to the tens of steps, for the model staying coherent. But yeah, even present day, it sort of tends to fall off the rails before too long. So some starting questions I just want to pose to kind of, get you thinking and, give you a sense of the kind of questions that we ponder on a day-to-day basis. One big question, of course, is just what does it mean for an LLM to reason? What is the line between a reasoning task and, a task that doesn't require reasoning? Obviously, on the extremes, it can be pretty obvious. If we're talking about a really hard competition math Olympiad problem, that's kind of clearly reasoning in some sense, and maybe chatting about the weather is something that we wouldn't consider reasoning. But of course, there's this like really broad spectrum, and like on, even chatting about the weather can have some elements of reasoning to it. And so, yeah, it's hard to draw very crisp lines here, I would say, but it's something we think about very deeply. There's also very interesting questions between what's the line between like creating new knowledge or even in the context of like solving a novel problem, and simply regurgitating information that's already seen. Again, this is another example where sort of the extreme is obvious. If it's literally seen the exact problem before, okay, then maybe we would just say it's like regurgitating the solution. But what if it's seen a very similar problem? Does that count? Is that regurgitation or not? Obviously, as humans learn in grade school and stuff, we learn a lot of things by rote, and we learn a lot, specifically in math. We learn to pattern match, very closely, and we're given a bunch of training problems in a given math textbook chapter, and then the problems that we're tested on are in fact very similar to those. But how different do they have to be, before either for humans or for LLMs before we consider regurgitation? This is clearly humans don't have the same capacity for memorization, so we're not as worried about this in the human case. But it's hard to decide where the line should be drawn for the LLM. And even if in some sense we say that all the LLM is doing is pattern matching, well, if you pattern match very well and and are always doing it right, and you chain many steps together, in some sense you could say that even if each step is like some form of regurgitation, because it's just seen this kind of thing before, if you chain that together into like a very long, complex, coherent argument or solution, then maybe you have produced something novel. But I would say that for the math problems that we think about, yeah, I mean, when you're studying this as a student, you never see a problem that is like completely unfamiliar to you. Obviously, every problem has some elements that are novel and some that aren't, and yeah, and so it's even leaning heavily on the pattern matching strength of LLMs, you can still basically produce what I would consider like novel, creative solutions. And then, of course, this kind of builds up to the question of, well, can an LLM like ever solve an unsolved problem? Obviously, right now in the domain of math, that hasn't happened. But I think the evidence very much suggests that like if we continue working in this direction, there's no reason in principle that couldn't happen. Because even when humans solve unsolved problems, they're very much putting together pieces that that they already have exposure to, and you can put together many known pieces to solve something that was previously unknown.
Carl, just a quick question from your edge. Are you talking about homework problems or about theorem proving?
Well, right now, everything essentially. I'll talk about this like a little bit more when I get into the data sets we work with. But we work with really a very wide range of difficulty. A couple of years ago, we were really focused on grade school math problems. So that would have been like really problems that fourth graders might do, for instance. These days, we're much more focused on competition math problems for like high school students. We don't currently do a lot of like theorem proving questions. We don't ask the model to write proofs, mostly because they're hard for us to auto evaluate. But in principle, there's no reason we couldn't be asking the model to write proofs. And certainly that's the direction that we want to head towards. It's just that it's much easier, practically speaking, for us to work with problems that have like easily checkable answers. But yeah, this covers the whole gamut of like, we're no longer so interested in grade school math problems because our models have sort of moved beyond that. But everything from high school, up to college to, solving unsolved problems is on the table. So I'll go ahead and give a kind of a partial history of just touch on some highlights of math and reasoning in LLMs. So yeah, about 2 years ago, we put out this paper basically introducing this grade school math data set, showing that at the time, what was the state of the art model, GPT-3, really struggled with these, relatively basic questions. This is a time when a lot of people are getting very excited about everything GPT-3 can do. And, on the one hand, it made significant progress on this data set, but on the other hand, it really showed that like, hey, these are what we would consider relatively basic problems, and the model hallucinates all over the place. And the main method we applied there was what we called training verifiers, or can also be called outcome-based reward models, where we give the model the final answer and tell it whether its solution was correct or not, and then it has to learn to judge its own solutions. So this is, for those of you who are familiar, basically it's just a reward model, and it judges its own samples, and then we can take many samples from the model and choose the one that the reward model likes best. And if we do this, performance on the data set goes up significantly. Some other highlights from the last couple of years, one of the big things that people have realized is that, step-by-step thinking or chain of thought prompting is very important. You have to get the model to lay out all its steps. And if you don't do that, if you try and let the model skip steps, then it's going to very likely do terribly. So in the most extreme case, if you ask it a hard problem and just say, give me an answer, a numeric answer right away, well, then it's definitely going to be terrible. But, even if within step-by-step thinking, it's important to get it to take the steps as granularly as possible. And, even it could write out 10 steps, but if there's a lot of thinking that has to happen between steps 6 and 7, then, maybe it's still going to produce an incorrect solution if it didn't break it down as much as it had to. Yeah, so for the whole field, I would say this is something that's, been very important to realize. Another thing that's very interesting is that using some form of self-consistency with the models often really improves performance as well. So self-consistency means basically take a bunch of solutions and see which ones agree with each other. And basically, you can kind of view this as just like voting among solutions. So take a majority of vote among the solutions. And if, if the most common answer after taking 100 solutions, says that the answer to the problem should be 7, then, maybe pick one of the solutions that ended up with 7 as your, as the solution that you want to commit to. And this, this gives a really strong improvement over baseline as well. And then Google put out this Minerva paper, again, just last year, where they basically, scale up a lot of these methods that work really well, and particularly focusing on putting in a lot of math and reasoning relevant data into the fine tuning. So if you take an LLM that's just pre-trained on the whole internet, well, it picked up some math along the way. But then if you fine tune it on, a very targeted math and reasoning corpus, then that's of course going to really bring out the best of its math and reasoning abilities. And yeah, and they sort of stacked this improvement with the self-consistency and other things I've talked about here, and to give what at the time was state-of-the-art performance on this hard data set.
Carl, quick question from the audience. What is the definition of reasoning in this case? Does it differ from human reasoning?
Yeah, so we definitely don't have a hard and crisp definition, because I would say that defining reasoning is very hard. We as a team choose to look at reasoning through the lens of math, because we think that basically solving math problems, the kinds of things that work well, will generalize to reasoning more broadly. But I would say that we don't take a very strong stance on what exactly reasoning, what exactly qualifies as reasoning and what isn't. I think you can give lots of loose definitions. For instance, reasoning would be something that, you can kind of talk about system 1 versus system 2 thinking. System 1 is reflexive, doesn't require reasoning, it's just very off the cuff. System 2 thinking requires a lot of deliberate thinking. It's the kind in language models, is the kind of thing that tends to require chain of thought. So, one definition of reasoning you could advance is things that require chain of thought to reach the answer, or to reach, some end state, are more likely to be reasoning tasks than things that don't require chain of thought. If you ask the LLM, who's the 3rd president of the United States, it's going to just tell you right off the bat, this, is not so much of a reasoning task. But none of these definitions are perfect. And for our purposes, we're really just focusing on math problems, and our assumption and intuition is that the lessons that we learn within math will transfer to what people generally mean by reasoning more broadly. Yeah, so I would say that the frontier of LLMs here has really been pushed back much more quickly than any of us anticipated. We released this grade school math data set about 2 years ago. I give a quick example of the problem here. It's just a very simple setup that grade schoolers would be expected to be able to do. And, at the time in 2021, the state of the art was 55% when we released the paper. And we kind of expected the data set would sort of last, at least a handful of years, but really, yeah, progress happened much more quickly. And today GPT-4 solves 92% of these problems. So we've really moved past this grade school math data set. There's another really great math data set out there that's 12,000 high school competition problems. These are harder, as you can see in this example, where there's a sort of number theory problem that's on the slide. And when this was released, the state-of-the-art performance was only about 7%. Again, this is the similar time frame when the grade school math dataset was released, this back in 2021. And I would say that, yeah, the field as a whole very much expected progress on this dataset to also be much slower than it's been. The fact that, Minerva got up to 50% last year is very impressive. And then, and we've continued to build on that as well. As I mentioned, the main things that were successful in the Minerva, like the previous state-of-the-art work, where it was fine-tuning on like a lot of math and reasoning data, doing chain of thought, and then doing self-consistency across those different chains of thought to determine the correct answer. So that sort of sets the stage for where we're at. The math data set is what we choose to focus on, because these competition problems are very challenging, and we're not yet at the point where we've solved them all. So with that in mind, we really asked ourselves the question, like, what is the bottleneck in large language model reasoning here? And the answer that we came up with when we started doing this project was that we were really bottlenecked by the reward models themselves. So for those I imagine many of you are familiar with RLHF, or reinforcement learning from human feedback. The idea here is that you train some reward model, often from human feedback, and then you do reinforcement learning against it to improve the model. And this is what's behind improvements in ChatGPT and really all sorts of LLMs. But of course, doing this is really only effective if you have a good reward model to begin with. If you have a reward model that doesn't understand certain concepts, then doing RL against this reward model isn't going to teach the LLM what you want. And in math and reasoning domains, we had what I would say are basically mediocre reward models. They understand very basic mistakes. And so that's why we were able to see improvement in, grade school math contexts by training these reward models. But they really weren't very robust. You don't have to generate too many samples to find one that sort of fools the reward model. And that's what the plot on the right here is showing, is that, as we take more and more samples, which is the x-axis, we eventually start finding adversarial examples against that reward model, as shown on the y-axis. Performance starts decreasing as you take more and more samples, because you're basically just finding these examples that fool your reward model. And what you want to see is, if you had a perfectly robust reward model, then the more you take samples, the more you move to the right along the x-axis, your performance just keeps going up and up and up. And if you're in that world, then that tells you that, okay, you ought to be able to use something like reinforcement learning from human feedback to really improve the base model. So so we really set out to just train more robust reward models than we'd ever trained before. And our main way of doing this was by using step-by-step feedback rather than basically solution level feedback, which is what we would have used before. So solution level feedback is just giving the model a full solution and saying that is right or that is wrong. And step level feedback is really saying, okay, like, here's exactly where the mistake occurred. And this is basically what we call process supervision. So I'll dive into process supervision a bit more here. And the baseline I was describing before is what we would call outcome supervision. So outcome supervision is just when you give feedback based on a final answer. And process supervision is when you really give this more detailed feedback. And this slide here is a really great illustration of this. On the left, so we have a very simple question: x squared equals 4. What is x? On the left, we have this faulty reasoning chain that happens to lead to the correct answer, 2 or -2. And if you're just giving outcome-based feedback, then you say, oh, great, that looks good to me. And then everything about that whole chain of thought is rewarded. But if you do process level feedback, then you're really only saying, which of these steps actually make sense. So the first step, x plus x equals 4, isn't actually correct, doesn't make sense. So that would be given, negative feedback. The second step makes sense, conditioned on the previous step, because, if you believe that x plus x equals 4, then sure, you can simplify it to 2x equals 4. And then the last step also doesn't make sense because, this negative came out of nowhere. So clearly using process level feedback is like more targeted and directed. And so we expect that if we have like a large amount of process feedback, that's going to be more valuable than outcome feedback. And you can kind of even say like, okay, well, so what? Like that's really obvious even, of course the process level feedback is better. It has more information. It's more granular. But really the main question then is like, well, how much more valuable? If it's only a little bit more valuable, then maybe it's not worth actually collecting it. But if it's way more valuable, then maybe you do want to, take the extra effort to collect this data, even though it's, in some ways a little bit more difficult to collect than the outcome feedback. So that's the core question, we were diving into is, if we do this, we collect a large amount of process supervision feedback, how good can we train our reward models? And we do this by basically using this kind of interface shown here. We would give a bunch of problems like this to our workers, and they would get to go through, and for each step, they would either give it like, a thumbs up, the smiley face, a thumbs down, the frowny face, or kind of a neutral rating. And the neutral rating can just be like, oh, it was like mostly correct, but something was like subtly weird, but not completely broken. But in practice, most of the ratings are either good or bad, but the neutral is just a catch-all for any ambiguity. And then we have the workers go through and rate all these trajectories. And that's basically the kind of data that we collect. So as I mentioned, the baseline we're using here is basically just using outcome supervision and to train what we call outcome supervised reward models. And the big advantage of the outcome supervised reward model is that you just don't need the humans because you have the answer key. You know what the final answer is. You can automatically grade solutions without any humans in the loop. And so it's very cheap. And so we can train these outcome supervised reward models very easily. And that's what, that's the number we're trying to get better than basically. And we do this on the math data set with GPT-4, and we were able to solve, about 72% of those questions. And so that's great. It's slightly better than the strong baseline of using self-consistency, what I talked about earlier. So, you see a little bit of improvement from using the outcome supervision. But then the question is, okay, how much better than that can we do with process supervision? So we collected about 1 million labels for about 100,000 solutions to all the math problems in this math data set. And we were able to get the process supervised reward models to score about 78% on math. So pretty significant improvement, still a ways to go. It's not saturating the data set at all, but yeah, a noticeable improvement. And here's sort of the breakdown of these 3 different methods. So the orange is showing the performance when we use process supervision. The blue is showing the performance when we use outcome supervision. And the gray is a baseline that doesn't require any supervision. It's just the majority voting, or the what I've been calling self-consistency so far, where you just take, and so the x-axis again is the number of samples we take, basically the amount of compute power that we throw at the problem at test time. And you can either, of all those samples you generate, you can either vote for the best solution, which is shown in gray. You can rank them with the outcome supervised reward model, shown in blue, or you can rank all those with the process supervised reward model, shown in orange. So why does process supervision help? Certainly, what we consider to be the biggest determining factor is that, process supervision is just providing a denser signal than outcome supervision. With the outcome supervised reward models, they have this very difficult task of deciding where in the solution the mistake is. So it's basically a hard credit assignment problem. You have like a very long trajectory with many, many steps, and it knows that something went wrong somewhere, but it's hard for it to figure out where exactly this happened. But in the case of the process supervised reward models, we're being very direct in saying, okay, the mistake was on step 3. That's what happened. And of course, that data is valuable. And then to a lesser extent, there's the issue that, if you're just doing answer checking, there's this issue of false positives, and that's going to corrupt some amount of the outcome supervised labels as well. And so one interesting question we could ask is, if we took an infinite amount of outcome supervised data, would it perform as well as the process supervised case? And that's a question I'll revisit here in a moment when we start looking at diving into like the ablations. But first, Well, I don't know. I'll pause for a second and ask if there's any questions, because that's basically the core description of the method that we're using. And if there are questions, now would be a great time to cover
Yeah.
them.
Guys, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions directly. I saw someone raised hand earlier. I see a question in the chat. Oh, okay, yeah, Ali. Yeah, feel free to ask your question.
Thank you so much for the great content. Have you ever thought about using curiosity and data synthesis to perhaps, proliferate, I don't know, unseen processes? For instance, ask an LLM to produce data for you, act as a student who's not great in so and so, and generate a process, and then take that as an input, and then, let's say, create instructions based on that.
So that's interesting. So you're saying like having the model like intentionally make mistakes and to try and design instructions for correcting those mistakes. Maybe you say a little bit.
Yes.
Okay.
But a
yeah.
separate model, maybe even be a different model, but not necessarily the original model, but a second model to sort of act in conjunction with your model.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yes, it's definitely not something we explored in this work, but having there are at least some areas that the model is good at self-correcting on, particularly if it makes a very obvious mistake. And so it could be useful to explore this further into because there's some amount of this process supervision data that the model could essentially already give to itself at baseline. And then there's other parts of the process supervision data that we collect that like the model would not have been able to label, like they really needed the human label. And so there's this question of like, of all the labels we collected, some amount of them really needed to be a human, but others maybe could have been the model, or maybe we could have generated a bunch more data and had the model like grade that. We have done one thing I'll talk about in a little bit is like how to do some of our ablations, we use the large model to grade smaller model solutions. So it's not like changing any prompts or coming up with anything like that, but it is using the model to like provide its own data. And I would say that in general, like whenever you can do something to like get the model to provide its own data, that's obviously a huge win. It can be challenging to do this because like if you ask the model to supervise its own processes, well, it's going to be right some amount of the time, but then it's also going to be wrong a bunch of the time. And what do you do with that noise? It's kind of a hard question.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks, Carl, for responding to this question. I see a question from Gilles. So he's saying, I struggle with providing results that involve infinite sums and series with LLMs. Think providing the results that involve a reasoning on Taylor-Maclaurin series. Is there any fundamental reasons that would make reasoning on infinite structures hard for LLMs?
That's interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I mean, yeah, my opinion would be that no, there's nothing fundamental about like reasoning on infinite structures that's hard for LLMs. I mean, humans abstract infinity, and our language models can like abstract infinity in the same way. I mean, obviously, hard abstractions become harder for the model, and so I don't know like how good their current ability is on like Taylor-Maclaurin series and stuff, but I think that one of the things that's very interesting is that, and I'll show some examples later here, but often the models kind of fall into the same, once they've been trained really well, they fall into some of the same failure modes as humans. So if there's like a subtle thing about the definition of infinity that's like hard for a human student when they're first encountering it, maybe the model is going to have the same problem. But ultimately, our hope is, of course, that like we're basically just any chains of thoughts that humans are able to follow, the model should be able to follow as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I could follow up on the questions.
Yeah, sure.
Mine? Yeah, thank you very much for that great talk. I really enjoyed it. So what I've noticed when I try to do proof theorems here is that basically the model should basically consider the full series, right? So infinity, but stops after 3 or 4 iterations, right? And so I was asking whether there's a fundamental reason as to why the model would not consider the full theory, but it looks like there is not. It just maybe what's available on the internet that stops after a few iterations. Is that a good way of thinking about it?
Yeah, I think so. I think that anytime our models right now have to like iterate some process or like, you know, even do like basic counting or, you know, a number of things like this, like they often kind of like are bad at it. They start the process, but then they don't know like, oh, should I stop now or should I just keep going forever? And this is the kind of thing that like as a human, you know, you're very intentional about if you're like iterating through something. Right. But you know, in principle, our models like should very much get better at this at some point, but absolutely, this is like a spot where they're kind of weak at the moment.
Awesome. Thank you for the context here.
I see Neeraj is asking.
Maybe we'll take one more question right now, and then I'll.
Okay. Sava, I see you have raised your hand. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, a question about the methods. I was just curious if you tried contrastive decoding as a method to improve reasoning for language model, and if it helped or did not help. Basically, when you have a dumb model and a smart model, and you basically contrast dumb model over smart model.
No, we have not tried anything like that yet. Yeah, I don't have all the intuitions here other than I mean my initial take, which you know could be miscalibrated or whatever, is just that like if our smart model is already really smart, then like doing something contrastive with like a not so smart model, I don't know that'll like the not so smart model is going to get fooled by everything. So like I don't know if it's going to push it in a great direction, but also I haven't thought about this too deeply. So.
Actually,
cool.
Just a quick question. Have you compared your method to methods that teachers use to train human children? This question from Neeraj.
Oh, interesting. Well, it's certainly not like directly. I mean, you know, directionally, we are all doing this process supervision is trying, you know, it's not deliberately trying to be more human-like, but like it has that property. You know, obviously, human teachers never just, or you know, not the good ones. I never just like say, okay, this you got the wrong answer, good, bad. You know, now I'm done with you. They have to like human teachers always have to give process level feedback essentially. So. Yeah, so you know we move in that direction somewhat, but obviously human teachers take it like even you know much further. You know, if we give process feedback to the model and say you know step 3 was wrong, there's no opportunity for the model to say, wait, I don't understand why. Please tell me more. Whereas that's exactly what like a human teacher would have to do. So we would love to. You know, I think there's a lot of advantages to moving you know more and more towards the way the human teachers teach human students because you know it's not that we have to adhere to that exactly, but I think there's a lot there. Yeah, there's a lot that can be learned there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, we can continue. Let's go through examples.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, I'll show some examples. You know, these are all like pretty objectively hard math problems, I'd say. You know, and there's probably a variety of math backgrounds in the audience. Don't worry too much about like you know reading through the whole solutions or the whole problems and really understanding them. I'll just kind of give you the high level here. So yeah, so here's kind of a hard competition problem, and this is basically just a visualization of what our you know how our process supervised reward model looks at these two solutions. So it's the same problem on the left and the right, and the left is a correct solution and the right is an incorrect solution. And you know green means that the process supervised reward model like that step, and red means that it didn't like it. And this is just a good example of like a reasonably hard problem that on the left, you know, the PRM just feels good about and it's indeed correct. So that's good. And then on the right, you know, it takes a bunch of good steps, but then when it says something that's actually wrong, and in this case, it's factoring this polynomial incorrectly, you know, the PRM says, oh, actually, I don't like that. Actually, subtle note, you know, the PRM isn't even saying that this is definitively incorrect. It's just saying that, you know, it can't be certain that it's correct. So actually, it could be that this is a good factorization. I don't think it is, but I'm not 100% sure. But the PRM will say that certain steps are bad, you know, even if all it means is that it's not certain about it and that it can't verify it. And so, you know, if you give it like a true statement, but you skip a bunch of steps, the PRM is very likely to say like, oh, you know, hold on there. I don't understand that. So this is really just a kind of a vanilla example of, you know, everything going as expected. Okay, here's a very a very simple problem with a very long solution. The problem is simple enough to understand. It's just simplify, tangent 100 plus 4 sine 100. I'm sure if you plug this into Wolfram Alpha, it probably knows what to do. But getting our model to like walk through the solution is a challenge, because this isn't a kind of problem. I mean, you can obviously brute force it if you have a calculator or something, but like if you're human and no access to a calculator, you have to think about this pretty deeply, and it really requires applying a large number of trigonometric identities in a not so obvious way. So if I were to sit down to do this, it would take me a lot of exploration. It would be the slow, laborious process. Probably I'd eventually get it if I had enough time, but it would be slow going. And what we find with GPT-4, or our version that's fine-tuned on math, is that about 0.1% of the time the model is able to solve this. So 1 in 1,000 samples are correct. So the vast majority are incorrect. And what we find is that the PRM is really good at finding the one sample out of those 1,000 that are correct. And this is it. This is all the other samples, 999 out of 1,000. The PRM somewhere said, nope, I don't like this step. It's bad. Throw it away. And this one, it says, oh, wow, this all looks good to me. And this is just a really, I'd say, impressive example of the model like solving this hard exploration problem where it has to really kind of get lucky almost in the way it applies the trigonometric identities, but it recognizes very well when it did the right thing. So on this math data set, we kind of did this, breakdown basically of like what are the remaining problems that we're not solving. So I bucket them here into 3 categories. The first is what I call subtle errors, where there's the reward model gets fooled. It likes the solution, but the solution's broken for what is qualitatively a subtle reason. Maybe it's some kind of mistake that like on the surface seems like it might be good, but just is in fact not. And I'll give some examples in a second. Careless errors are really just more blatant versions of the subtle errors. The model just makes some flat out bad mistake, and for whatever reason, the reward model still gets fooled. And I'll show some examples of that. And then the last category is basically what we call exploration problems, where the model never solved the problem. So there was no solution that fooled the reward model, but there was also no solution that the reward model even liked in the first place. So what this says is that we just, we need the model to be better at solving the problems in the first place. This category indicates that we're not actually bottlenecked by the reward model here. We're bottlenecked by the ability to produce solutions in the first place. So interesting that to see that there's both a lot of problems where we just need the base model to be better. And then also between the kind of careless and subtle errors, it's about a 50-50 split, where sometimes, it's this more nuanced error and sometimes it's a really blatant error. So here's an example of what we call a subtle error. This is this counting problem. And it's very interesting because, I don't want to spend too much time, on the section here, so I'll go through it kind of quickly. But the model ends up making a very, understandable, almost human-like mistake, where in passing the balls back and forth, it says something that seems very reasonable, but it just miscounted. It's not counting essentially one of the symmetries in the problem, and a human could totally make the same mistake, if they're not thinking too deeply about it. And so this is the kind of thing that, it's not really surprising that the reward model gets fooled by this, because each step, and in particular the incorrect step that I've labeled down here, sounds very good. It's kind of not obvious to determine that step is in fact broken. But of course, ultimately we want to get the reward models to even be better and better at recognizing these kind of mistakes. Another example is in composing odd and even functions. Really, the model kind of gets into this pattern matching mode where it thinks, oh, okay, I've latched onto something that's a good strategy for solving this problem, and basically, it thinks it recognizes the pattern between how the negative sign should propagate between odd and even functions, and it says some things that are true in the beginning, but then it just generalizes incorrectly, and it thinks it can just keep charging head in that direction, but it can't. So again, if you're not thinking too closely about it, you might be like, oh, okay, well that sounds good on the surface, but really it's the issue is that the model, in some sense, didn't think deeply enough about it, and that's where it gets stuck. And so this is another example. The reward model is like, yes, this sounds very good to me, but it's just not true. And then there's some other examples of just careless mistakes. So the error here is down, towards the bottom, and it's this whole long problem, and the model's doing great, doing a lot of things correctly, but then it just flat out doesn't, simplify this expression correctly. And if you dive into the math, like it sort of double counts something, I think, or subtracts it from one side and not the other. It's just a careless error. It's not obviously humans make a lot of these careless errors, but we would want our reward models to be paying closer attention here, and for whatever reason it missed it. And then another example kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier on just like iterating and counting and stuff. This is just a very simple example where the model lays out the sequence, and it has to count the number of terms in the sequence. It actually has to count I think the period of the sequence, and it does it incorrectly. There's like 14 or something, or the period is maybe like 11, and it says it's 12. And yeah, this is for any of you that have played with the model a bunch, I'm sure you've figured out that's kind of just bad at counting on the fly sometimes. And unfortunately, our PRM throughout this data collection process didn't learn that that's something it's not very good at. Okay, and so now I'll talk about a couple of interesting ablations that we were able to run to kind of get a better understanding of some of the details of process supervision. So one thing that's, obviously ablations are like often very important in doing good science, but it's very difficult for us to, run ablations at scale because we spend a bunch of money collecting this process supervision data from humans, and you can't just change one thing about that experiment and rerun it very easily. So what we decided to do is to basically rerun the whole experiment, but with a smaller model, and then use our trained GPT-4 with all the PRM data and stuff to do the labeling for this ablation version of the experiment. So we're basically just using the larger model to teach the smaller model, and this is great because we can have the larger model teach the smaller model in either an outcome supervised way or a process supervised way, or we can change a lot of the relevant details here. And so this makes it way easier to do these ablations because now we can do it without needing any more human data.
Carl, quick question. I think not everyone understands what ablations means in this context.
Yeah, fair enough. Good call out. So ablation just means we change one thing about our experimental setup and try and determine how much it mattered. So one thing is there's a couple that are interesting. One is there's a couple different ways of providing outcome supervision, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But we kind of had to we committed to one in the first version of the experiment because we weren't able to do the other one. But at smaller scale, we can ablate both of these decisions by just basically just doing multiple versions of the experiment and seeing and controlling for different variables and seeing which ones mattered. And so I'll talk about some of the specific ablations we ran here in a moment. But the first thing to do, of course, is just before we even do any ablations, is just to make sure that this new setup of using the large model to train the small model reproduces essentially the same qualitative results as before. And so we use the large model to provide process and outcome supervision. Right now, focused just on the orange and green lines in the graph. And then the x-axis here is showing basically the amount of data we labeled. So it's basically, the amount that we were willing to hypothetically spend on human data collection. And again, in this case, it's done by the model, but in the larger case, it would have to be done by humans. And what we find is that, the orange is reaches a much higher performance than the green for basically any data collection budget. So if you're willing to collect, on the far right, a very large amount of outcome supervised data, which is shown in the green curve, then you actually are better than just a very small amount of process supervised data. But if you collect a lot of process supervised data, then of course you're way better than the outcome supervised the outcome supervised model would be. So this was good news for us, just in that we qualitatively see the same results we're seeing at large scale, but at small scale. And so now we know that the experimental setup is good. And so we can start answering, yeah, we can start doing these ablations essentially. One question I'd asked earlier is, if we trained an ORM on infinite data, would it perform as well as a PRM? And this kind of tells us that, okay, infinite, yeah, maybe it would. I mean, it's clearly at any given fixed amount of data, it's performing significantly worse. But, eventually, if you're willing to collect, 1,000x more data with an ORM, then maybe it is about as good as a PRM would be. One of the ablations that we got to do was really answering the question, how much is this false positive problem an issue? False positives, again, being a solution that is broken in some way, but happens to reach the correct answer. If you're using outcome supervision, sometimes you're going to label these incorrect trajectories as correct, and that's not good. That's not good for the reward model. It's not going to generalize well. And we can use the PRM here to, by using the PRM to provide essentially outcome supervision, but by making sure that every step is correct, we are more or less eliminating these false positives. And that's different than just having to rely on the final answer. And that's the difference between green and blue here. So blue is basically just relying on the final answer, and therefore you're going to have some amount of false positives. And green is using the process supervised reward model to make sure that the whole solution is good. And therefore, you're much less likely to have any false positives. And if you remove that, you have a higher quality data set, and the outcome supervised performance goes up a little bit, but it's still not as good as the process supervised performance. And then another interesting thing that I'll just touch on real quickly is that I haven't said a lot about it yet, but we did use a form of active learning in doing our data collection, where we're basically, we want to get the most out of the human data as possible because it's expensive, asking humans to label problems. And so we want to show them not just like any old solution, but we want to show them solutions that are fooling the current best reward model that we have. So we would take our PRM, that's partially trained on the current data that we've collected, and then we would generate a bunch of solutions and find the ones that it really liked the most. Because if we service those to humans, and then they say, oh, there was an error somewhere, well, that's much more valuable than a data point where like the PRM might have already known that there was an error. And active learning is common in a lot of settings, and we basically found here that this wasn't a crazy impactful decision, but it did increase our data efficiency by about 2.6 times. So, if you're spending a lot of money on human data, it's worth doing. And that's basically what we see here in red. It's just that if we use this active learning setup, yeah, the performance is slightly better. You can, of course, match the performance if you just collected more data, but overall it is more efficient. Cool. Well, getting close to the end here, I'll just touch on some future work briefly before opening it up for questions again. So one of the really cool things about this is the connection to AI alignment. So obviously, OpenAI cares a lot about alignment, and really we spend a lot of time thinking about how can we make sure our models stay aligned to human values. And in the context of math, that really just means producing solutions that are, that humans can interpret and humans can understand, and that don't do some wild thing that's like inscrutable, basically. Or don't, somehow adversarially produce correct answers for like all the wrong reasons, or and don't misrepresent like the reason why that answer is true. And by doing process supervision, of course, we are basically like aligning each step of the reward model. Where the process supervision ensures that like each step that is labeled as a correct step is something that the human approves of. Both that's kind of encompasses a number of things. It's like both interpretable and like follows clear reasoning and everything like this. And what we, in general, it can be the case that some alignment methods are subject to what we call an alignment tax. You put in some effort to align your model to make it more agreeable to humans, but maybe this makes it less capable in some ways. So, because your model has to be extra polite, it now becomes less good at solving math problems for some reason, because it spent more capacity on being polite, or, who knows exactly. And there are examples of this sort of thing happening in practice. When we align our large models, it can be the case that, performance degrades along some other axis. But at least in this case, we find that process supervision is, actually an example of a negative alignment tax. We get what we would consider a more aligned model, but it also improves performance. And it's basically very convenient for us if these two things go hand in hand, because if methods that, there's always going to be a pressure to deploy the most capable methods. And so if those are also the methods that happen to be most aligned, then, incentives are aligned, and that's really good. Yeah, and some future work. It's always really interesting to understand more about data efficiency, and so we're always interested in like methods that maybe could reach the same results that we got with the process supervised reward model, but maybe with less problems or maybe with less human feedback. So that's something we continue to think about. We have open sourced this process supervision data set, because, it was a very expensive data set to collect. And, I think there's a lot of things that we're excited to do with it internally, but it's a real barrier to entry to like external researchers to have to spend a lot of money to collect human supervised like labels for individual steps. And so by releasing this, it gives more people the opportunity to play with this data set and see if they can do anything cool with it. And certainly we're excited to continue iterating with it internally. And yeah, lastly, just understanding how much these results generalize outside of math is really important, both from the alignment angles as well as just the general capabilities angles. And so that's something we'll continue to think about as well.